I'm going to cover some of the ground Phil did already. I didn't know what Phil was going to talk about, so there's maybe some overlap here, but I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the basic biology that we know about these skippers. I want to point out that little logo there. A lot of our research in the last several years has been funded out of the Environmental Natural Resource Trust Fund, and they always like us to acknowledge that when we give presentations. I wasn't sure what kind of audience we would have here today, and I thought maybe a little background about what are skippers. A lot of people are a little puzzled. Are skippers butterflies? Are they moths? So I threw this in. They're Lepidoptera. Lepidoptera has many different families, and Hesperiidae is a big family, which is the skippers. And it's broken into many subfamilies. The Hesperiidae is one of the many families of Lepidoptera that are considered to be butterflies. We break the Hesperiidae at least in our part of the world, we have these three subfamilies, the Hesperiidae, or the grass skippers, which are the subject of our concern right now. Jessica's dusky wings, which are, I put Pyrgini in quotation marks because the current view is that that's not a phylogenetic entity, a monophyletic entity. And then there's this intermediate. We have one species, the little Arctic skipper, a whole Arctic species that is considered an intermediate. But the grass skippers are our big concern. And some of the features, they have a characteristic profile when they have their wings folded, sort of dart-shaped, and they're different from the spread wings. They hold their wings in two planes when they open their wings. These guys hold them in a single plane, and so does this guy. But they always sort of separate their hind wings and forewings when they spread their wings. All right. Dakota skipper is one of our topics, and you've seen pictures already. One of the things I would mention is that the females are quite variable, much more so than the males. And they're also sexually dimorphic. The male has these little structures on the wing that are involved in courtship and mating. They are pheromone-producing organs. The females don't have those, and they have these clear spots, square spots on their wings. That's true of almost all the grass skippers, but not true of the Poweshiek, where the sexes are basically indistinguishable. These are two different subtribes or tribes of the subfamily Hesperiidae. The Poweshiek belongs to a very small group of species. It's not very many, and we have in North America just a handful. The life history information previous to the recent work is basically two published things. One is by Tim McCabe, who's a lepidopterist in Albany, New York, with the New York Museum of Natural History or something like that. Tim was from the Felton area in Minnesota, so he has a background as a kid working with Dakota skippers and Poweshieks when they were plentiful. And then my doctoral thesis, which I did in Southwest Minnesota. Poweshiek, we're even skimpier on that. We have this 1972 paper by McAlpine where he was working in Michigan. He noticed they were laying eggs actually he reared some larvae on what he called lawn grass, presumably Poa pratensis, Kentucky bluegrass. He got those eggs from females that he captured. He did observe all the behaviors that we've become familiar with and published descriptions of them. Holtzman actually observed oviposition in the wild on a sedge, an Eleocharis or spike rush. And that's been in the literature now for decades about that's the host plant for Poweshiek. So first of all, by the Dakota skipper, the egg, it's a little hemispherical thing with basically featureless chorion or shell, flat-bottomed, about a little over 1 millimeter in diameter. As to what the females lay their eggs on, they lay their eggs singly, and they develop these eggs slowly during their lifetime. They don't have a whole mass of eggs ready to go when they emerge from the chrysalis, like the silk moths, for example. They produce eggs over a period of time, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But they lay their eggs singly, and Tim McCabe's paper that I referred to said that they don't lay eggs on grasses, just on broadleaf plants, but they do lay their eggs on grasses. And these are my records from about 34 observations of wild females ovipositing, and got 19 on grasses, and there's a variety of species, big blue stem, little blue stem. You'll have to forgive these old names. This was back from 1981. Side oats, grama, prairie drop seed, porcupine grass, and this little panic grass, and then 13 different species of forbs. Just pictures of the various stages. One of the interesting things about the skipper, and this is true of probably most of the grass skippers, is that the final larval stage matures these glandular patches on the last couple of segments in the abdomen. They produce a waxy product that's hydrofugic, very strongly water repellent. And when they pupate, they make a loose cocoon, and they writhe around in that as they spin, and it gets impregnated with this stuff, flakes off in little flakes. And I've pulled the cocoons underwater, and they hold an air bubble tight. They make the cocoon largely impervious to water penetration. Behavior in the wild, as Phil mentioned, these guys go down to the base of grasses and they build shelters. These are these little tunnels of the openings of the shelter. The shelter is basically under the surface, and they come out to feed. This is what they do. They typically do this at night, but they'll come out and crawl up a grass blade, and they'll cut it off. They just kind of gnaw a little notch until they've got the blade just at the midrib, and then they grasp it in their mandibles and pull it loose. Take it back down into that shelter and consume it in the shelter. So they minimize their exposure to predation while they're feeding. I should add that all this is old work. I did this work a long time ago, and Eric and Cale at the zoo have got a lot more observational insight they can add to this, and don't hesitate to point out limitations. This is like the story of the blind man and the elephant. You know, each one touches a certain part and says the elephant is this, and so this is my little part of the elephant. They hibernate as a partly grown larva, fourth, fifth instar, seems to vary. And they're underground when they hibernate. This is a larva in spring. There's his head. This was burnt off. You can see he survived the burn. After a molt, they appear to come out to the surface and build a cocoon or a shelter on the surface. So they're more exposed now in the spring. And they pupate in a similar kind of shelter. That's a pupa, and the gray color is that waxy hydrofuge material that's coating the pupa itself. Larval host plants, this is a big question. What do the caterpillars require for nutrition? Well, they're grass feeders and possibly some sedge feeders, but I had records this was part of an experiment on the effects of burning, but I had these plots set out in the intact prairie, and I populated them with newly hatched skippers. And for those that survived the burning, I went in subsequently and looked at what they'd been feeding on, and I found that most of the feeding on those semi-free choice situations was big blue stem, little blue stem, prairie drop seed, side oats, grama. There's a limited amount of choice. There were a number of grasses that weren't included in those pots. But then I did a little designed experiment to confine them on single species to see what they would do. And I used these here, the one Poa pratensis, and then little blue stem, side oats, prairie drop seed, and then a C3 native C3 grass, prairie June grass. And basically, I didn't see, the statistics said there's no real difference in those that survived up to hibernation. I had to stop this work at the hibernation period, but they appear to be capable of feeding on a variety of these prairie grasses, and they survive quite well on them. And I found in the wild they will utilize, from their shelter, will feed on different species of grasses. They're not particularly restricted. Adult feeding is also a crucial factor. Eric mentioned the impact of haying if it removes the floral resource. These guys depend on a floral resource for moisture in the minimum and nutrients for probably as well. As I said, they mature eggs slowly during their lifetime, so the longer they live, the more eggs they can produce, and they have to have this water and some energy input. And these were flower species that I observed them nectaring on and during my work, and V means very frequent. I didn't even keep count, it was so common. That's purple coneflower. Verbena stricta, males occasionally, females frequently. That's this purple flower here. Astragalus insurgens, which is milk vetch, that's this one here. Common males, frequent females. The little evening primrose here was an occasional rare use, but I did see them use it. And blanket flower, which has the same habitat as this, it's an earlier flower, and it's usually pretty much gone by the time Dakota skippers emerge, but when it's still there, they go to that as avidly as they go to the purple coneflower. Tim McCabe's paper said that they used this flower, this little Mexican hat or small yellow coneflower, and this daisy fleabane, or one of the fleabanes, the more common nectar sources. That may be a difference between North Dakota and Minnesota, but I never have ever seen a skipper on this fleabane, and I never saw one on the coneflower either. So it's just something about movement. They don't appear to be highly mobile or highly vagile. This was a mark recapture work. This means most of the recaptures were within the same unit that they were marked in. These transfers between units were relatively uncommon, except for here, which was really not much of a separation in habitat. This is lifetime fecundity. I did this where I kept females for a long time, getting over, and then I dissected them after they died to see how many undeveloped oocytes were still present. I came up with a maximum fecundity, potential fecundity of about 200. And in captivity, I kept females about 19 days. So here's a plot. This is, in the field, I found that from the mark recapture that life expectancy for females is around 10, 11, 12 days. And this is from 3 females, a graph of accumulated egg production by percentage of what they ended up laying. And if you go to the 10 or 11 day thing, you see they've laid about 80% of their potential fecundity. And that makes a big difference in this species about how long the females can survive, because it makes a big difference to how many eggs they can lay during their. Now, Poweshiek skipperling, we know a lot less about this guy, at least I know a lot less about it. These are the stages, some of the stages, not all of them, but the egg is a little bit smaller than Dakota. The skipper is a little bit smaller. They have this interesting behavior of always resting head down. That's the, and then they pupate, and they do not, as Phil pointed out, they do not make any kind of shelter. They're unusual in the skippers, in that there's no shelter at all. They're just out there on the grass. They pupate like a traditional, some of the butterflies that make a suspension cable around their waist to hold their chrysalis upright, also up on the grasses. Some of the behavior, one of the things, what grasses are they using? I found them laying eggs anyway on a whole bunch of different things, bunch of grasses. I didn't ever see them laying on forbs, but I think the Canadians have. This behavior is interesting. McAlpine noted this when he reared his, that they notch a blade like this, and then they go up and rest up on the blade, and they feed at the tip of the blade. And my hypothesis is that that serves as a way of disguising their profile when they're sitting on a blade so that they're not as conspicuous. They've sort of broken up the outline of the blade. This was my one free-range larva that I found feeding on side oats grama. And this is the way they spend the winter, as Phil showed in that slide. They just park on the blade and make a little silk pad and wait for cold temperatures and hang out there for the winter. Adult feeding, in the area where I worked, where purple coneflower was the principal nectar source, that was their principal nectar flower. That's a Dakota skipper sharing the flower with a Poweshiek. The Canadians and Michigan black-eyed Susans are the principal. And Holtzman, the other guy in Michigan who wrote a paper, said this was a principal nectar flower. It's a small lobelia. This is just a shot of habitat with lots of, this is in Minnesota, lots of black-eyed Susans. There used to be Poweshieks here, not anymore. This is the grass that people have sort of decided is maybe the most likely candidate for a larval host plant. It's prairie dropseed. It has a very fine, narrow blade. And if I've got a few moments, I just was going to elaborate on what Phil showed about what's happened. This is when the Dakota skipper was listed in Minnesota in '84, first time state listed. These were our records at the time of its occurrence, and we listed it as a state threatened species, mainly because of its limited habitat. After the list was revised, up to the time the list was revised in '96, we'd added those blue locations. So we weren't terribly worried. We looked like the skipper was doing okay. Then in 2007 to 2009, some limited surveys just turned it up in a few places, but still the numbers were strong. But by 2012 and on, we have been unable to find the skipper except in these two spots up here, and Phil showed you this Felton Prairie, and the second spot is one female observed in 2015, and we've not been able to find it again. And then same thing for Poweshiek, '84, when we listed it, lots of records. We added a huge number of records after 84 to about 96, and so we were convinced that special concern was still an adequate listing for the state. And then between 96 and 2001, we were still adding new locations, so we didn't worry too much about it. But then in 2006, we did some survey, and we were able to find it in only 3 spots in Minnesota. And after 2006, we have not found it anywhere in the state. Those are the big circles are the sites that we have surveyed since 2014 on every year fairly intensively. So that's why we now list it as a state endangered species. Thank you. Questions? Any time for questions?
If you have any questions, microphone, the room will capture the rich discussion.
Here, George. when you did your studies on the host plants, I'm assuming those are all native grasses,
Yeah.
right?
Except for the POA, the Kentucky bluegrass.
Okay, okay, so that was in there?
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess I don't remember. So was it able to feed on
They,
that?
they fed on it and developed pretty much the same as on the other grasses. Yeah.
So then, what we were saying earlier about the forage grasses interfering with the skippers wasn't necessarily with the larval feeding, it was more that if they crowd out the flowers, then there'd be less adult feeding.
Did everybody hear that question? Do I need to repeat it? Okay. I don't really, this is a speculation, but brome grass, smooth brome, which is a major domestic forage grass, is a rhizomatous grass. It's not a bunch grass. And it's a fairly coarse grass with a long culm, and the leaves come off the culm up. Structurally, it's quite, I would imagine, impossible for newly hatched larvae to survive on that grass because it's making a shelter down at the base. It uses the bunch grass structure of these grasses to facilitate the construction of its shelter. Then it's got to migrate up to cut off a blade. The blades of brome grass are broad, too big for a little skipper larva. So I think that it's a grass morphology problem, basically, for the skippers. Bluegrass, I'm not sure what the problem with bluegrass is. But brome, I think, is structurally just an impossible grass for them to live on. They'll feed on it. I fed them in captivity on brome grass, and they'll eat it and survive. But one more? One thing that I didn't mention or emphasize is that during the period of the predominant period of spraying for soybean aphid control, these guys both are little bitty caterpillars. They're sort of in their early stages of growth and presumably being tiny little things much more susceptible to limited amounts of pesticide. Thank you.